Growing up, my life was a constant battle with my psychopathic mother. She made every day a living hell until I finally managed to move away from her, but even then she couldn't let go. As an act of revenge, she started stalking me, trying to frame me for heinous crimes. Her plans, however, backfired spectacularly, leading her to completely lose her mind in the courtroom. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. On my 21st birthday, I decided to celebrate at a bar with some friends. Everything was going great until my mother showed up, dressed in a full wedding gown with her hair and makeup done in a bridal style. When it came time for the cake, she took it upon herself to blow out the candles, clapping for herself as if it were her moment to shine. Later, when I got up to dance with one of my friends, she physically shoved my friend aside and began dancing with me. I pried her off, but she responded by screaming so loudly that the band stopped playing. She grabbed my ear, scolding me for embarrassing her on her big day. The entire bar was staring at her in shocked silence. The bar owner eventually had to physically escort her out as she continued to yell, but even that wasn't the end of her antics. To truly understand my mother, you need some context. I was not only the youngest in the family but also the only boy, which meant I was perpetually seen as a baby in her eyes. Growing up, she constantly tried to infantilize me. When I was 17, she attempted to spoon-feed me and then complained that I wasn't being supportive when I refused. She would gaslight me when I didn't cave to her demands. Her behavior has always been manipulative and narcissistic, turning everything into a reflection of her. Some people even said she had a queen mother complex, expecting to be honored and revered on every holiday, even my birthdays, which she somehow managed to make about herself despite doing none of the planning or work. Her behavior only became more unsettling as she aged. At 45, she openly discussed getting a facelift and breast implants to look 20 years younger, all while giving me side glances. My father refused to pay for these unnecessary procedures, leading to numerous fights where she labeled him as unsupportive and spent weeks playing the victim. One particularly embarrassing incident happened at church. I was 22, and she insisted on going up with me to receive the holy bread, then tried to feed it to me, telling me to chew slowly in front of everyone. That was the last straw. I packed up my things and moved out, renting a small room at a friend's parents' house for $200 a month. As I was leaving, she spent nearly the entire time begging me to stay. I told her that I was her son, not her husband, and that I was tired of her behavior. I needed to live my own life. She ran off sobbing, and we didn't speak for months. During that time, my cousin told me she was going around telling everyone that I would come running back to her any day. When I didn't, she lost it. Even as an adult, she continued to speak to me as if I were a small child, often doing so in front of others and expecting me to play along. When I didn't, she would first look at me pleadingly, but I remained stone-faced. This would anger her, and she would grab me by the arm, trying to drag me outside to loudly whisper in my ear, but I always resisted and even threw her off a few times. When my mother refused to let go, her behavior escalated. The last time she tried to cling to me physically, she dug her nails into my shoulder, forcing me to swat her hand away. That seemed to push her towards a more emotional manipulation strategy. We both attended my uncle's birthday party, and while we were there, she followed me around, loudly talking to my aunt about how I used to breastfeed as a child. She even lamented that she couldn't still make me do that, casting that familiar pleading look my way. I felt nauseous. My aunt, who had heard about my mother's antics but never truly believed how bad it was visibly disgusted. That moment was eye-opening for her. When I refused to cater to my mother's demands at the party, she eventually had a meltdown. She loudly proclaimed that she was the matriarch and that everyone had to obey her. She then tried to order me to come to her, but I reminded her that I didn't live with her anymore and didn't have to do as she said because I was no longer a child. For the first time ever, several family members backed me up, which genuinely shocked me. My mother, enraged, screeched at all of us and stormed out, only to call me multiple times later, attempting to gaslight me over the phone. I let all the calls go to voicemail and made the decision to leave my hometown for good. At that time, I had a girlfriend whom I really liked. We had been dating for a few months, and she wanted to meet my family. I was hesitant and warned her about my mother, but she seemed to think I was exaggerating. That changed quickly. My mother was particularly passive-aggressive when they met, clearly upset that my girlfriend was taking her baby away as she whispered to a relative over the phone, thinking no one else was listening. Later, while cutting a cake she had baked, my mother gave my girlfriend an eerie stare while holding a large kitchen knife. Needless to say, my girlfriend couldn't handle my mother's behavior for long. We ended the relationship amicably, as she didn't want to risk having someone like my mother as a mother-in-law, and honestly, I couldn't blame her. When I told my mother I was moving over 1,000 miles away, she went ballistic. She tried to latch onto me, saying she wouldn't allow it, but I shook her off and told her she had no power to stop me. I had been saving up for years and finally bought a truck and camper trailer. I spent the next 2 years living out of that camper while working a simple job in Northern California. During that time, I cut off contact with my family entirely. Eventually, I met someone new and we've been together ever since. Neither of us is particularly interested in marriage or having children, which suits us just fine. In 2016, I finally broke the no-contact rule with my parents, but I laid down some strict ground rules. They were to treat me with the respect of an adult. They were not to pester my girlfriend, and they were not to talk to me like a child or bring up anything from my childhood. Of course, my mother couldn't adhere to any of these rules when we visited for Thanksgiving. She immediately reverted to her old ways, so I told her I was done and not to bother calling me until she could accept that I was a grown man. In December of that year, I received multiple calls, emails, and texts from her begging me to come home for Christmas, but she insisted I come alone without my girlfriend. I told my mother that if my girlfriend wasn't welcome, then neither was I. She called me unreasonable and even went so far as to insult my girlfriend, calling her an interloping __ who was intruding on our special bond. She insisted that no woman should come between a mother and her son, practically ordering me to attend the family Christmas gathering. When I refused, she escalated, making empty threats of self-harm. I calmly told her that she could do what she wanted with her own body, but I would not be coming to Christmas and would instead spend it with my girlfriend's family. My mother furiously warned that I'd regret my decision before slamming down the phone. 2 days before Christmas, the door to the small house my girlfriend and I were renting was kicked in by the police. They were under the impression that we were running a drug lab. We were detained and interrogated while the police ransacked our yard, turning it into something akin to a flea market as they dragged out our furniture and personal belongings to inspect. They went through the house with a fine-toothed comb, using sniffing dogs, but all they found were some aspirin and medication I was taking for depression at the time. The officers seemed disappointed, clearly expecting a big bust. It turns out this whole ordeal was orchestrated by my crazy mother. She had called the police and provided them with details so accurate that she must have been stalking us. She claimed I was using my camper as a front to sell drugs, likely inspired by too much watching of Breaking Bad. When the police found nothing in the house, the vehicles, or the camper, they were forced to put everything back and release us. My girlfriend and I were understandably furious, but all I could do was file a complaint, especially since the police had caused some damage to the house, which upset our landlord. Update: I pressed charges against my mother for stalking and attempting to frame me, but I avoided spending much time in court because it would have meant being near her. What I'm about to describe comes partly from my own experience and partly from what my dad told me. To begin with, my dad had no idea that my crazy mother had taken a flight to my state to stalk me. She had told him that she was going on a short vacation for her mental health and never mentioned where she was going. My poor dad was completely in the dark about her plans. Otherwise, he would have warned me. During her trip, my mother spent several days secretly following my girlfriend and me around, using her smartphone to document everything. She even used a spare key we kept hidden inside a fake rock to break into our house and take photos of everything she could. When she returned home, my dad noticed that she seemed unusually smug, wearing a look that he described as someone who believed they had won some sort of twisted game. She was uncharacteristically happy and giddy until the police showed up on Christmas Day to arrest her. My dad said she was bawling her eyes out, insisting she hadn't done anything wrong as the police escorted her away. The evidence against her was undeniable. All the photos she took were found on her phone, and my dad quickly pieced together what she had done. The call she made to the police, claiming I was involved in illegal activities, was traced back to her smartphone without any difficulty. When confronted with the evidence, my dad said she broke down, crying and begging, and when she refused to get up from the table, the police had to physically move her. My dad also mentioned that no one, including him, bailed her out of jail. She had to use her own money to secure her release. Apparently, she briefly considered calling me to beg for help, but in a rare moment of clarity, she realized there was no way I would bail her out after what she had done. As a result, she spent some time locked up before finally using her own money to get out. Despite all this, my mother didn't try to run. She genuinely believed she was justified in her actions and thought she could convince a judge to see things her way. When her lawyer advised her to plead guilty, she fired him and decided to represent herself. Predictably, this decision backfired. The case moved through the courts faster than I had anticipated, and my girlfriend and I had to fly back to testify against her. I only stayed as long as was necessary for the trial and then left as soon as I could. I took the first flight I could back, but during my time there, my mother couldn't stop staring at me. Her gaze fluctuated between that unsettling, pleading look and pure, unbridled rage. When she took the stand, she delivered a bizarre speech about why she believed she was in the right. She insisted that I needed to be taught a lesson for refusing to return home and for putting another woman before her, declaring that she should have been the only woman I ever needed. Throughout this speech, she kept trying to lock eyes with me, but the judge repeatedly instructed her to stop. I left before the sentencing, but I later heard that the judge deemed my mother mentally unwell. When he stated this, she erupted, claiming she was completely sane, which only made her seem more unstable. She argued that she was just a mother looking out for her son and did what she had to do to teach me a lesson. My dad, who was in the courtroom, finally spoke up and said that if she had truly cared about me, she wouldn't have tried to turn me into her second husband or frame me for crimes I didn't commit. That set her off, and the guards had to keep them apart. Originally, the judge had considered being more lenient, but my mother's behavior convinced him otherwise. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, and when she heard the sentence, she threw a full-blown tantrum, pounding her fists and crying like a toddler. She refused to cooperate and had to be carried out of the courtroom,